Welcome to another Naturetrek podcast, where we bring wildlife to you in your living room. In this episode, it seems punk is not dead, as tour leader Niki Williamson talks to us about the reintroduction of the Northern Bald Ibis in Andalucía. And I'm your host, Sarah Frost, Naturetrek's marketing manager, and bringing this podcast to you from lockdown in Alton. Welcome to another Naturetrek podcast. Now, joining me today is tour leader Niki Williamson. Now, Niki has worked and volunteered for the RSPB for 12 years, managing habitats, honing her birding skills, and brandishing power tools with varying levels of success. And for 8 years, she was part of an advisory team working with nature-friendly farmers to make the countryside a better place for wildlife. She's also been involved with Operation Turtle Dove, working to ensure a future for this desperately declining bird. As well as the UK, she's worked on vital projects with conservation grade in West Africa, but now lives in southern Spain near Tarifa, where she works full-time as a wildlife guide, and she's joining us on the line now from lockdown in southern Spain. Niki, hello, welcome. How are you?
Hi everybody. Hi Sarah. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So how is life going in lockdown?
Yeah, it's okay. We're getting there. I know we're one of the lucky ones because we live in a small village outside Tarifa, so we can at least look out of our windows and see the beautiful countryside. We even get to see some migratory birds, migrating raptors going right over our house sometimes. So we've got some nature to keep us entertained. So it's cool.
Yeah, always got the binoculars on hand. It sounds like
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I know you've worked on projects a lot in the UK and also in West Africa, and today you're going to be talking about something that's particularly close to your heart, and that is the Northern Bald Ibis. Now I know what the Bald Ibis look like, and I'm sure many of our listeners do too, but can you just describe them for people who aren't familiar with them?
Yeah, well, but they're just quite extraordinary looking, really. A lot of people immediately look at them and say that they're ugly, but I think they're anything but that. They have this extraordinary iridescent plumage, which covers their kind of, turkey-sized body and really, really shines when it catches the sun. So from the neck down, absolutely gorgeous immediately. But then their heads are bald, as the name suggests, and this strange, raw-looking, painful-looking pink mask covers their entire face and ends up in a huge down-curved bill. Just really extraordinary-looking bird. The plumage starts with a kind of mohawk from halfway back on the head, this enormous kind of feathered crest. And they always just look a little bit confused by their own appearance sometimes. I always think we get to see them a lot at a nesting colony near here. And they just have this kind of extraordinary air of bafflement, I always think. But the way they behave towards each other is just so endearing and charismatic. They preen each other. They go to huge lengths to, when they're building the nest, they bring back gifts to one another when they're renewing the nest at the beginning of the breeding season. So you might see a female sat in the nest, for example, and the male will turn up and he will have brought some gift for her, which could be anything from a twig, a kind of useful gift, right?
What a charming.
Yeah.
They really know how to treat their ladies, don't they?
Yeah. Or sometimes they'll come back with something really disgusting, like a used tissue or something like that. But she'll be equally pleased, whatever it is that he's brought. And the interactions are just really fantastic to see. Really charismatic bird.
Wow, lucky female bald ibis with used tissues. How lovely. Well, the name Northern Bald Ibis suggests that there's a southern counterpart. Is that the case?
Yeah, there's the Southern Bald Ibis is in South Africa. It's quite similar looking but different. It has a much whiter face with red on the top. But the Northern Bald Ibis is very much a separate species that used to cover, the range was huge. It used to cover the whole of Europe, but it's retracted right into a couple of very small remaining areas now. So it's a really very, very endangered species.
So that's their current status. Are they critically endangered, or?
It's got better recently. At one point, they were in the top 10 most endangered birds of the world, because all of their existing wild populations had dwindled to a few individuals. But especially thanks to ongoing conservation work in the core population in Morocco, they've actually been downgraded from critically endangered to endangered in 2018. So there's some light at the end of the tunnel for them, certainly.
Okay, so presumably you're going to tell us about your work and conservation with the bald ibis, but why is this conservation needed? What's gone wrong to bring them so close to extinction? Presumably they haven't always been in need of conservation or so close to extinction. So can you just describe for our listeners what has happened to their population over the last 100 years or so to bring them to the point that they are now?
Yeah, basically it's this kind of perfect storm of all the things that we hear about that result in species becoming endangered. I suppose the top culprit, you would say, is agricultural intensification, as it often is. There's a big hit. They feed largely on large-bodied insects, crickets, grasshoppers, locusts, frogs, young nestlings if they find them, kind of omnivorous, but large-bodied insects being a big part of their diet. So of course when DDT was broadly used in the 70s, that was a huge impact. Loss of habitat through agricultural extension, habitat degradation, but also persecution, because in the past they've been revered as kind of almost religiously iconic birds in some areas, but also because of the way they appear, they're kind of feared as evil spirits or witches. So they've been shot and persecuted as well in their history. So basically all these things have just combined. Loss of nesting sites as well. They're cliff nesters, and finding cliffs to nest on near enough to the pastures that they need to feed on becomes increasingly difficult as human population expands and areas are taking up. So all these things are kind of combined to just really almost wipe them out. At one point there were just a couple of hundred birds left. So they came very, very close to the edge of disappearing altogether.
Wow. And what is the species level now? What's the population level?
So there's still less than 1,000 of them in the wild. There's the main population is in Morocco, in two sort of nearby areas in Morocco, and they're, as I sort of mentioned, they're doing well. They're increasing. There's around about 700 birds in the wild. They're truly wild remnant population. Then there's a population in Turkey of around just over 200 birds, but they're migratory, and so many are lost on migration that they've actually started taking the population into captivity. So they're free during the breeding season to reproduce, but then they're taken into captivity to prevent them migrating, because so many die or are shot or are in some way lost on migration that they can't be allowed to do that anymore. Then apart from that, there was a small population in Syria was rediscovered in the early 2000s, really small, maybe 20, and they dwindled back down to nothing again. There was just one female bird left. And then, of course, the civil war started there, and it was that population's considered extinct again. So,
and of course, it's such a shame and such a challenge for them, where presumably so much of the habitat that the bald ibis needs to forage and find food is now sadly obviously occupied with refugee camps and things like that, presumably.
Yeah, it's just, apart from anything, it's just impossible to get in and continue any conservation work there. Yeah.
So there's just no way to even think about reintroducing them there.
No.
So what conservation efforts are being done in the areas where we can work, or at least when lockdown is lifted, that you are able to help out? What is it you've been working on yourself?
Well, what we're particularly lucky here in the Straits, because there's a really very successful reintroduction project which was started in 2004. It was a partnership. There's quite a number of partners in there, but the main ones being a fairly local zoo where they're very experienced in captive breeding, and the local authority as well. They reintroduced birds onto nearby military land, where there's cliffs and, obviously very low intensity grazed pastures because it's military land, and a lot of peace and quiet for them to just kind of get on with being ibises. So they started there, and they reintroduced the first 30 birds in 2004. And then they carried on. I think it was around about 200 birds were reintroduced over the sort of first phase of the project, the first 5 years. By 2008, they had their first nest. And by 2014, they had pretty much filled every available nesting site on those cliffs. And as they do, the way the colonies reproduce is when they sort of fill a space, a small number of pairs will tend to branch off and go and start a new colony somewhere else, which is what's happening in Morocco, incidentally, at the moment. But here, that happened in 2014. 5 pairs left the main colony, found some random little cliffs next to a car park and some cafes alongside a main road, and said, well, this looks perfect. We'll try here. And they've been really successful. The same 10 pairs, that colony's been going on since then. It's still there. Certainly last year when we were looking, there were an additional 2 pairs who were trying to sort of squeeze in along the other side. And we were seeing chicks with 3 and 4, nests with 3 and 4 chicks in them, making use of the surrounding area. There's lots of pasture land, low intensity grazing, that sort of thing. So it's really fantastic to be able to take people there to see them as well, because obviously they're just right next to the road.
And what do the locals think of them? Are they interested in them the same way that in Britain there's a growing interest with the public of wanting to get into bird watching? Are the locals interested in them there, or is it really just tourists that are coming to see them?
I think that the groundwork done for the project was done exceptionally well. There was a lot of community work went into explaining to people what was happening, and when the birds turned up there on these cliffs, the locals really took them to heart, and I think also it's because so many birders go to see them, that continues the interest. And obviously, you can go into those cafes on Sundays, and a lot of the customers there are birders, and they can really get interested and see why it's beneficial to have the birds there. One of the cafes has changed its logo to feature a Northern Bald Ibis. I noticed last year, so definitely taken to heart. And they've built a little hide and interpretation centre opposite the colony now as well. So it's a well-known attraction now.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And of course, all of these people that are going there to see them are staying in local accommodation. They're providing income. They're spending money in cafes, restaurants, and what have you. And it obviously helps the local economy. So I assume people will see benefits that way as well. So they're doing well in that car park in particular, it seems. But how is the overall Spanish population doing? What about other threats that they might have?
Well, obviously it's interesting this year because of the lockdown, and which activities are considered essential work and which aren't. Monitoring work is obviously depleted this year compared to others, but certainly until last year the wild population here is holding steady at about 80 birds in the main colony, and then there's this additional sort of 10 to 12 pairs in the roadside colony. So yeah, they're doing well. They were in the initial phases of the project. When you have a population that's this small, kind of small accidental threats can make a really big difference to their success. So I know in the first years there were problems with them hitting power lines, and there were areas of power lines where they were getting electrocuted. But they funded quite extensive repair work to stop that happening, because one small area where they're constantly getting electrocuted makes a huge difference to a tiny amount of animals like that. Certainly recent worries for the roadside colony. There was 2 years ago now, I think there was a roving eagle owl and it came into that area. It's a lovely little area next to a river, and there's also a colony of cattle egrets in the trees down there. So it came down and it wiped out the entire breeding cattle egret colony, and then it moved on to the Northern Bald Ibis colony. So I think it took, basically it was almost farming them. It was just going back night after night and just taking one chick, two chicks. And it took a while to figure out what was happening. You know, they thought maybe it was some kind of musselid, you know, a stoat type predator. But they eventually caught it on camera. So they captured the bird and relocated it to somewhere else. And it left one chick that year. One chick survived. And we were really concerned that they wouldn't go back because they're very, they're colony nesters, you know, they're tightly bonded as a colony. And we were worried that the trauma of just having seen an entire generation wiped out would mean that they wouldn't nest there anymore. But, you know, they came back and none of the breeding adults were lost. And the following year was probably the most successful ever in terms of fledged chicks. So that was great. That they're as resilient as that, you know, so hopefully they'll continue to do well.
Wow, so they now are spreading across Spain despite the challenges that they're having like this, considering natural challenges as well as the threats from humans, which you've just outlined. And with records coming from Spain, and I read France and Italy as well, could we, you know, expect bald ibis in the UK in the near future, or is this, you know, never to be expected?
Well, wow, that would be a thing, wouldn't it? They're certainly mobile, and I think you know, we've seen from the Reintroduction project on the cliffs, they've relocated to this one, you know, a few miles away, where we can see them on the colony. They've also been observed quite regularly. Small groups of them actually just fly across the straits to Morocco, groups of 6 to 10, sort of that kind of size, the same kind of size, like as if they're looking to start a new colony over there. Which is great because like we're used to seeing things like short-toed eagles struggling against the wind and going, oh, it's too difficult. And then there's this incredible bird just goes across for the day just to see what happens. And also last year, actually, they were a group tried to spread north and they got as far as Extremadura in Spain, which unfortunately they were then shot. Somebody shot them for no apparent reason, because that would have been the real, if they had made it to, in my head I always imagine they might have made it to Monfragüe, which is this amazing mountainous area of Extremadura that some of Naturetrek customers probably know quite well. I can just imagine that they could have set up there, and that would have been the real mark of success, that this small colony of 80 birds in southern Spain were now recolonizing Spain in big numbers. So that would have been fantastic. I think a way to go before you'll be getting them on your lockdown garden birding list.
One can only hope.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay, so they seem to be doing fairly well in Andalucía. And is it actually easy to see these birds? If someone was to come to Andalucía, Naturetrek clients, for example, and wanted to see the bald ibis, how easy is that? Where can they go?
Well, I mean, in the breeding season, it's just fantastic because the hide that's been built now is meters away. It's across the road, and you can watch them really anytime. You know, they'll be turning up there. And I think the first records this year back on the nesting colony were in late February, and they'll be right through the breeding season. You can see them close, all this charismatic behavior, really, really fantastic. But even outside that, you know, once the autumn comes and the chicks and adults have moved off the nest, they tend to turn up it's a little bit more of an adventure going to find them, but we always try. And they turn
and of course this is what you do. Yeah.
Things.
And this is what you do on Naturetrek tours, don't you? You're guiding our guests to go and find them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's there's many attractions in the Straits, but the Northern Bald Ibis is such an iconic sort of bird. It's fantastic, and they're quite confiding. That throughout their it's just part of their behaviour that they're always found close to human activity. Part of that is avoiding predation, or because of the pastures that we ourselves have created in the past for them to use. They're quite associated with humans, so when we do find them out on the fields, you can really get quite close to them. They're really astonishingly tame almost, even though they haven't been raised as tame birds. They're just a naturally very confiding bird, so you can get really, really good views of them out in the countryside as well.
Wow, that sounds wonderful. It sounds quite tempting, actually, especially right now.
You should come out, definitely. We'll show you a bald ibis.
Yeah. You've strangely tempted me to see one. They do sound quite charming animals, really, when people look at them and think, oh, it's a face only a mother could love.
Yeah, right.
And what do you think what effect do you think the lockdown will have on the population?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, just the brief sort of moments that I get to wander outside when I'm taking the dog out, I really get the impression that everything's so alive and nature's really moving back into spaces where it wasn't before. We have a much bigger spotless starling roost right in the middle of the village than we've ever had before. You can really hear them in the evening. But for the bald ibis, it's a little bit different because, especially on this roadside site, that's most likely that they chose that because of the proximity to human beings. All the bars and the traffic and the car park means that they're much less likely to get predated. So it's interesting. It's going to be really interesting to get back out there and see how the colony's doing once we're allowed to go out and see. But hopefully they'll be doing just as well as ever, and it'll turn out that they don't need our help that much after all anyway.
With all of these abandoned bars and restaurants, you might get back to see all of these wonderful presents that are in the bald ibis nests, with lovely bottles of beer and things that have been taken back to the females. They've upgraded from twigs and used napkins and gone to using forks and knives and things like that.
Yeah, right. Raided the kitchens.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh dear. And Niki, we're hoping that lockdown, for everyone's sake, of course, ends as soon as it's able to. But looking beyond that, what do you think the future holds for the bald ibis? Is the outlook good?
Well, let's hope so, Sarah. Yeah, certainly for our small colony in Spain, the future looks pretty bright. They're really hanging on against all the odds. And that when that colony broke away and headed north, that was such a positive sign. That's the beginning of something really special, and it would be so fantastic to think that they start recolonizing the whole of Spain from our small little project here in Andalucía.
Well, let's hope with the work with public engagement and getting people on board with actually protecting these magnificent birds, that when the time comes that they do decide to break north again, they won't be received in the same way, but will have a warmer welcome. And we very much hope to be able to anticipate seeing them on, indeed, Naturetrek tours in the likes of Extremadura, as you've suggested. So we'll keep our fingers crossed very firmly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Niki, it's been a pleasure talking to you and having a fantastic snapshot insight into the wonderful life and conservation of the bald ibis. If you'd like to travel with Niki to see bald ibis, or indeed any other tours that Niki may be guiding, you can see her tours on her profile on our website, www.naturetrek.co.uk, and just go to her profile. Thank you very much. To listen to more of our podcasts, just go to our podcast webpage at naturetrek.co.uk/podcasts. Thanks for listening.